Welcome to the first lesson in Unit 4, where we're going to start to look into the market structure of oligopoly. As we've already set up in class, the last two market structures that we have to study are a little bit less defined than in terms of the graph and the analysis than were monopoly and perfect competition. But with oligopoly, there's several interesting things we can do with it. So starting off with oligopoly being characteristics of it, there's few firms, obviously, and then remember that you could have either differentiated products or not differentiated products. It doesn't really make any difference in terms of whether it's an oligopoly or not. So we talked about examples of both of those, and a differentiated example would be the aircraft manufacturing industry between Boeing and Airbus, and an undifferentiated oligopoly industry would be the chemicals with several different large producers of basic chemicals like chlorine and things like that for pools. In any case, the key thing is that there are just relatively few producers holding a large share of the market. And here's a table from your book that shows some oligopoly industries based on the measurement called the four-firm concentration ratio, which is the percentage of the total market that is held by the largest four firms. So that might even be two firms, but it's holding the majority of the market. But the four together is what the number is here. So in the cigarette industry, these four largest firms here hold 98.9% of the market. And these down the line are oligopoly industries based on the four-firm concentration ratio. Typically, what is making them an oligopoly instead of, say, a monopolistically competitive industry is that you've got large economies of scale that are acting as barriers to entry. For instance, with most of these examples here, we're just talking about distribution, especially cigarettes through breakfast cereals. You know, the cost of production or the capital needed to open to start a firm that produces these things is maybe not that great. You know, you could produce your own light bulbs today at a relatively low cost. However, it's kind of the large distribution and market hold that these companies have historically, especially if you go back to General Electric, started by Thomas Edison, that historically gives them kind of a barrier to entry to other firms trying to come in and compete in that market. So a lot of times these economies of scale are things that are set up because the company is so big and so old and has such a big distribution network that becomes difficult for other companies to compete with. And that's what you see there. Automobiles may be a little bit different. That's one where it is pretty hard, pretty capital intensive. Think about how many millions of dollars it takes to start your own automobile firm. So a lot of oligopoly industries, such as automobiles, such as the oil production, crude oil industry, you've got a big barrier that it's really capital intensive business. You've got to have tens of millions or even billions of dollars in capital to get one of those things started. So there's not going to be a whole lot of them coming in to compete. So we talked about how they typically in oligopoly industries you'll see them differentiate their products if they can, though it's not always possible. You can still have an oligopoly without it. And that here's the term that the AP test likes to use: interdependence. The oligopoly industries are characterized by interdependence, which means that firms have to decide their behavior based on the behavior of others. So firms' choices are impacted by each other, highly impacted by each other. That's true to some degree in monopolistic competition also. We'll talk about that. It's especially true in oligopoly when there's only a few firms acting. You know, they're really in tune with what the others have. They have to be in tune with what the others are doing. And then because of the nature of oligopoly, you have the possibility of collusion for the benefit of firms, but not for the benefit of the consumer. Collusion is two firms acting together, two or more firms acting together, coming into some sort of agreement to produce in a way that has them acting more almost like one firm, cooperating to act more like a monopoly than it does to have them being competitive. So that's just an overview of kind of the basics of what goes into oligopoly markets. We're going to do in this lesson the simplest analysis we can of a theoretical oligopoly industry to show a couple things about it, to show both where the interdependence comes in, how their choices are impacted by the others, to show the possibility of collusion, but also to show the difficulty of collusion. Collusion often is difficult to maintain without some sort of written and enforceable agreement, which is illegal in the laws of most countries. So we'll see the benefit of collusion, but also the difficulty of collusion by this duopoly example. So duopoly just means there are two firms, and we're just going to assume for the purposes of this analysis that we've got an undifferentiated product. Consumers are not interested in which company they're buying from. They're willing to buy whichever one is selling it the cheapest. And here is, give the price and the quantity demanded is going to be, hopefully you recognize that as a demand curve, demand data for this duopoly. And the usual kind of calculation that we make from this, like we did with monopolies, find the total revenue, and we're going to want to find the marginal revenue to figure out the profit maximizing. Again, we're going to use the marginal revenue equals marginal cost concept. And we're given a marginal cost of production for this duopoly. We're going to say the marginal cost is equal to $3. So we're going to start looking at it like this. If this industry were a monopoly, a single firm producing with this demand curve, this marginal cost, then what output would it produce? So we know how to do this. This is review. Let's go back and do it. So the marginal revenue is equal to the change in total revenue over the change in quantity. And we have a change in quantity to deal with here. Calculates 10 each time. It makes the math easy. But our marginal revenue is going to be 110 over 10, 11, 90 over 10, and so on. Start to get negative marginal revenue here. Okay, so from that data, hopefully you can tell the profit maximizing point if this were a monopoly industry and the marginal costs were equal to 3. So it would be, monopoly would choose the price of $7. It would sell 50 units, and their total revenue would be $350. Let's assume no fixed cost, and we can find the profit here for a monopoly. And then we'll relate this to a duopoly. So the profit, if it were a monopoly, the total is total revenue minus total cost. Total revenue we have right over here from the table is $350. Total cost is going to be equal to $3 times the number of units. It's a constant marginal cost of $3. Quantity of 50 is 150. So that's $200 in profit. Now let's say for the moment that the two firms in this duopoly decide to collude, and they decide that it would be in their interest, and it actually would be in their interest, as we'll see, to if they could come to an agreement where they each split this market in half, act as a monopoly, in other words, produce the monopoly price and quantity, and then split the profits. So what that would mean is that each firm would produce, we've got firm 1 producing half of this total quantity of 50, so produces 25 units at $7 a piece. Firm 2 produces 25 units, charges $7 a piece. They each make total revenue of $175. Finding each of their profit here. And they each spend total cost of 25 times $3, so 75. So they each make a profit of $100. Doesn't sound as good as $200, but they're basically splitting in half the profits of what it would be if one of them had a monopoly over the industry. That's actually the most profit, the most total profit that the two of them can make. We should be able to recognize that since this is the profit maximizing point for a monopoly, that means that 200 is the most total profit of any of these choices. If we were to calculate the profit from any other point along the demand curve, there wouldn't be any total profit that's higher than 200. So if they collude, that maximizes their total profit. However, there is an incentive for them to cheat on this agreement. We're going to use that term a lot in oligopoly. If they come to an agreement, is there an incentive for them to cheat? Let's look at that. Let's say that they first get together in a room and they say, okay, we're going to produce 50, and then one of the firms thinks about it, goes back and says, well, you know what? Um, why don't we produce a little bit more than our 25, and maybe we'd be able to make a little bit more profit that way, sell a little bit more than 25. We're going to have to drop the price to do so. And if they try to sell more in the market, it's going to drive the price down. So here's how that works. Say that firm 1 is the honest firm to the agreement. They continue to produce 25. And firm 2, they cheat. They decide to produce 10 more, to produce 35. That means that now our new total quantity is no longer 50, it's 60. And that means to sell 60 in the market, we're going to assume that they're going to have to drive the price down to $6. So the price now that they both have to charge to sell all of their goods is $6. They can't price discriminate here, we're assuming. So what happens here to each of their individual profits, TR minus TC? Now we got to do it separately because now they've got different stories here. Total revenue for firm 1, it's 150. Minus total cost for firm 1, 25 times 3 is 75. So firm 2 cheated and they ended up reducing the profits of firm 1 to $75. What happened to firm 2's profits? Was this in their interest? Well, their total revenue is 35 times 6, which is $210. Their total cost is 35 times 3, which is $105. So their total profit is now $105. Not a lot more, but all other things equal, they'd rather make a profit of 105 than the previous situation of 100. So what we've shown here is that each firm, you could switch this around and make this a story for firm 1 versus firm 2. Each firm has an incentive to produce the higher quantity, to cheat on the agreement, because doing so is profitable for that firm individually. It reduces the total profit. Notice the total profit in this industry now between these two firms is only 180 compared to 200 before. But if firms are acting in their individual interest to maximize profits, we can assume that a firm would have an incentive, would want to do this if possible. And if this seems like kind of theoretical and far-fetched, in real life this is exactly what happens with OPEC. And we'll talk about that more in class if you haven't already. In any case, what we've shown here is in a duopoly simplified analysis affirms the benefit of collusion, but to the firms together, but also the incentive for firms to cheat on collusive agreements. And therefore, if they can't make them binding, which they can't do legally, then they tend to not exist. And the kind of outcome of this is that while it seems like oligopoly would be pretty bad for consumers, in practice, oligopoly tends to be pretty close to competitive levels. It tends to be more competitive in terms of lower price and benefit to the consumer than in terms of consumer surplus than you might think. The last thing to kind of show that is to say that this market is competitive and the marginal cost were equal to $3. Well, then in that case, we would look at, okay, competitive market, if marginal cost is equal to the demand curve. Remember, we're looking for where on the demand curve does it cross through $3. And so that's here. If it was competitive, the total output sold would be 90 at a price of 3. But of course, to the firms together, if they're acting as a monopoly, they would never do that. They're getting into negative marginal revenue territory. But if you kept doing this exercise of how long are they willing to cheat that maximizes their profits, really they keep adding to their individual profit until they hit this point. Like it continues to be better for them as individual firms, if they're kind of short-sighted, I guess you could say, to continue to increase output and drive the price down until they hit that competitive point. So that's why an oligopoly industry, simplified version here, but why an oligopoly industry tends to approach competitive type situations in a lot of cases. All right, so we'll do a number of those problems in the book to kind of drive those points home. Again, here's the outcome of it. Each firm's profit will be higher if it limits production note that to act as a monopoly, they've got to hold back production compared to what they might want to do to increase their individual profit. But even if they make that kind of agreement, they have an individual incentive to produce, as long as the marginal revenue gained by the individual firm is greater than the additional marginal cost they're taking on, which is just another way of saying what we did in the last slide. And so what we generally see that their options are, this is the interdependence, coming back to this idea. What does interdependence mean? Well, it means firms usually have to have a choice between a few different kind of ways of operating relative to each other. They could try to explicitly collude, but that's usually illegal. They could engage in some sort of tacit collusion, which is kind of like they watch what each other is doing and kind of follow the leader, watch each other closely, try not to fall into the trap of engaging in a price war. Skipping down to this one, when you talk about price competition, this is kind of supposed to be a picture of that. If they kept driving the price down to the minimum competitive level, then that's called a price war. If they keep kind of trying to undercut each other, and both firms don't want to do that, so they're trying to watch each other carefully to try to figure out, okay, at what point maybe are we both comfortable with what we're doing, and in the interest of our long-term profitability and sustainability with these two companies or 3 or 4 companies, let's not just try to undercut each other on price. More often what we see in oligopolies is that they're competing based on just trying to sell the most quantity they can by differentiating the product and by advertising, which is just a method of differentiating, which doesn't make it ultimately that much different than a monopolistically competitive industry, because that's similar to how monopolistic competitors try to maximize their profit too. But if you go back now, last thing here, to look at these, you can kind of see this. I mean, think about sports fans, all the ads that you see during March Madness or whatever else for different beers, trying to they're not trying to undercut each other on price so much as they're trying to they could probably produce the stuff for cheaper. They're not engaged in a price war. They're trying to get the demand for their particular differentiated product up. Light bulb's a little bit different, not as differentiated, although they're trying more. Breakfast cereal's definitely differentiated. You can see more of you can see in all of these, they're not as cheap as they possibly could be. We're not seeing price wars happening here, but you definitely see them trying to differentiate themselves based on quality or on the type of product that they sell. Okay, we'll stop there before we go on to more with oligopoly, and we'll do some of this in class.